Hello, everyone. Welcome to another of our talks this term in the series that's been organised by the Future of Food programme, which is part of the Oxford Martin School. And my name is Charles Godfrey. I'm director of the Oxford Martin School. And it's my great privilege and pleasure to welcome Jamie Lorimer, who's giving the talk this afternoon. Jamie is Professor of Environmental Geography at Oxford. His PhD was from Bristol, where he worked on changes in UK conservation policy after the Rio conference. And he joined Oxford in 2012, and he had been at King's College just before that. Jamie's research interests are manifold. They encompass the history and politics of wildlife conservation, across a wide variety of scales, from elephants to the microbiome. And we've worked together as part of a big Wellcome funded project, the LEAP project, over the last 5 years. And Jamie has been working on the part of the project that looks at the social science dimensions of meat and dairy and their alternatives. And I have to say, I've learned a huge amount from Jamie about social science research in food over the last few years. Jamie's written a number of books, Wildlife in the Anthropocene, Conservation and After Nature, and a new book, which he's going to be talking about, or partly talking about today. And that is called The Probiotic Planet, Using Life to Manage Life. And the talk this afternoon is going to concentrate a little bit more on regenerating the food system. Welcome to the audience from all over the world. If you see in the bottom of your screen, there is a little bar that says ask a question. And please do ask a question. We will talk for about 30 minutes and then have 50 minutes for questions. And not only can you ask a question, you can vote on a question. And that's very useful for me in picking which question to ask Jamie. So with no further ado, Jamie, thanks very much for speaking to us this afternoon, and over to you.
Many thanks, Charles. I'm going to start just by sharing my screen and bring up my presentation. So let me toggle over to that. So hopefully, Charles, you can now see my slides up on the screen there. And if that's the case, I will just get I'll just get going on the presentation. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today. As Charles says, I'm a social scientist. I'm based in the School of Geography here in Oxford, and I'm broadly interested in popular understandings of nature and how they come to shape how life is understood and managed in different parts of the of different policy domains. And today I want to talk specifically about the implications of a book I've written recently on what I'm calling the probiotic turn for agriculture and the food system. And I start really with a broad sort of framing of the argument in the context of the diagnosis of the Anthropocene. And this will be a diagnosis that I imagine is increasingly familiar to many of you in the audience. A proposal by the recently deceased Nobel Prize-winning scientist Paul Crutzen, that due to the magnitude of human impacts, the planet is moving out of the Holocene into a new state, a new condition that he suggested we should describe as the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is the outcome, Crutzen and others have documented, of the great acceleration beginning in the 19th century, but really accelerating through the 20th century. Associated with the accelerated use of a wide array of Earth systems elements, such that the Earth is coming up against a set of thresholds or boundaries that will tip us out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene. And the argument that I develop in the book is that we can usefully understand the Anthropocene as the outcome of the application of an antibiotic mode of conceiving and managing life. And by antibiotic, I don't mean just the use of particular chemicals targeted at particular microbes, but a much more profound way of thinking about and governing ecological systems. So antibiotic approaches involve systematic efforts to rationalize natural environment to optimize human health. This often involves the simplification, the control, the smoothing, the the acceleration of ecological systems, very much enabled by natural science and modern technology. So to ground this in some examples, we can think about the Anthropocene as an antibiotic model, both through the application, as I say, of particular chemicals, the development of pesticides that enabled modern farming to come into existence, the development of technologies for pest control, shown here, systematic eradication of bison here, shown in the US, but scaling it out to the rise of modern monocultural agricultural systems premised on a high level of simplification of ecological systems in order to optimize yields for agriculture. And scaling out even to a further level, we can think about this antibiotic model characterized to the way in which geological processes or geomorphic processes have been organized, for example, around the domestication and control of rivers and flood regimes, shown here in the Netherlands. And there's much to be celebrated from the application of the antibiotic model. We've seen substantial increases in cereal production here, shown in yields to deliver global food security. We've seen substantial decreases in the levels of famine and hunger, shown here in this data from Our World in Data. This declining trend in undernourishment in developing countries since 1970. We've seen substantial increases in life expectancy, really taking off coincidence with the start of the great acceleration towards the beginning of the 20th century and accelerating through the 20th century to the present day. So much to be celebrated as an outcome of the antibiotic model. But there's a growing sense now that the excessive application of antibiotic techniques are leading to what Rob Wallace describes as blowback. So forms of Anthropocene blowback, where blowback are the unforeseen and unwanted effects, results, or a set of repercussions from the successful application of this way of conceiving and managing life. And again, if we think about that across a range of scales, we might think about it right at the beginning at the microbial scale, a growing sense that the intensification of agriculture, particularly the intensification of livestock agriculture, has become pathological, has become a cause of diseases, both zoonotic diseases, potentially COVID, the origins of COVID yet to be established, but certainly pre-COVID, a great set of concerns around zoonotic flus, swine flu, bird flu that would come across the species boundary and be widely distributed through the global agricultural system. And likewise, concerns about antibiotic resistance, that the use and abuse of antibiotics within intensive livestock production is creating the conditions for resistant organisms to come into existence and for their genes to spread across the microbiomes so that they come to cause problems for humans as well as the animals in which antibiotics are developed. So manifestations of blowback at a micro scale. Similar concerns expressed increasingly now by epidemiologists and public health experts that the rise of modern forms of managing life, particularly around modern diets and modern sanitation, and the use of antibiotic drugs in human populations is leading to widespread microbial dysbiosis, so ecological imbalances in the human microbiome, or what Martin Blaser describes as missing microbes, that are associated with what Moises Velasquez-Manoff, a science writer at Nature, describes as epidemics of absence. So substantial increases in allergy, autoimmune allergic disease correlated with epidemiological patterns in microbial dysbiosis. So again, a concern that human health is suffering a blowback as a consequence of the overuse of antibiotic techniques. If we scale out to a landscape scale, well-established concerns, for example, about soil erosion, about the loss of pollinators, about the loss of agricultural biodiversity as a consequence of the successful rationalization of landscapes optimized for food production under modern farming techniques. Again, another manifestation of this blowback as a consequence of the excessive application of antibiotic methods. And again, moving out even further on the landscape scale, we can think about well-established concerns expressed by socio-ecological systems theorists that the what Greg Holling describes as the command and control model of natural resource management is in itself pathological. This successful efforts to domesticate forests, to control rivers, in and of themselves create the conditions for extreme events, extreme fire events, disease outbreaks. This is a bark beetle outbreak shown in the middle picture there, or extreme flooding events that we've seen increasing in the UK as a consequence of the ways in which we've accelerated and smoothed river systems to try and move water fast through the landscape, that creates the preconditions for these extreme events, these in forms of blowback, if you like. And we can begin to think about scaling this right up to the planetary scale in the context of the diagnosis of the Anthropocene, in the sense that Holocene conditions are being tipped out of. There's a sense that the tipping out of the Holocene conditions is a wider manifestation of this blowback, what Lovelock describes as the revenge of Gaia, this dystopian future in which all sorts of systems unravel as a consequence of the ways in which life has been conceived and managed under the Anthropocene. So this is a very grand meta-narrative being developed here, but hopefully elements of it are familiar, and you can see how thinking across these different scales starts to allow us to make connections in the common drivers of many of the environmental and health problems that face us in the present. And this diagnosis of blowback has provoked a wide array of different responses that again will be familiar. We have a strand of denialism, very ascendant in strands of US politics, particularly visible in the last election. We have a contrasting strand of catastrophism. We're all doomed. There's nothing much that can be done about this. We have a strand of what I would call accelerationism, a sort of continuation of business as usual, the sort of Silicon Valley model of move fast and break things. But the responses that I'm particularly interested in this talk are more transformative. They're trying to diagnose the problem and think about alternative ways of managing life to try and secure human and environmental health in the future. And so the book that I recently published back in November claims that we can see a common set of what I would describe as probiotic responses to the diagnosis of the blowback of the Anthropocene. And by probiotic, I'm interested in efforts to use life to manage life. So particular ways in which ecological science is being used to modulate the circulation of ecological systems to secure desired functions and services. And I'll give a range of examples of this in a second. But the key elements of this is this idea that in understanding the dynamics of ecology, particularly understanding the role played by what are described as keystone species, so species that have this disproportionate ability to configure the dynamics of the ecology that they're within, a range of scientists and policymakers are trying to restore the desired dynamics and system states of the ecologies that they're managing across a wide array of different scales. And we need to understand this probiotic turn as a deliberate response to the diagnosis of antibiotic blowback. In some cases, it advocates a return to what we might describe as prebiotic practice, sort of pre-modern practices, traditional practices that have yet to be reconfigured by antibiotic approaches. But the key idea here is that there is this sense of crisis, a moment of profound anxiety that leads to new ways of thinking about and managing life. And what we'll see in the examples that I'll present in the rest of the talk is this not a rejection of modern science and technology. It's not a rejection of the gains that we get from an antibiotic model. Instead, it involves this ecological recalibration, if you like, of the ways in which life is conceived and managed across these different scales. Okay, so to flesh this out with some empirical examples, the table that's coming up on your screen now tries to tell that story across the columns that are shown. And here we're just thinking about developments on the micro scale. So the second column in describes this antibiotic model of managing life. The middle column diagnoses the common forms of blowback, in this case associated primarily with the loss of microbial diversity. And then the right-hand column begins to sketch out a range of what I describe as probiotic alternatives in which scientists, policymakers, citizens are using life to manage life in order to restore desired forms of ecological function and service. So we can think about that on the domains of health, hygiene and food and diet, which I'll come on to talk about in a bit more detail later. But we can also scale up to the macro scale, to the landscape scale, and the planetary scale to again detect a common historical narrative that moves from the antibiotic model through forms of blowback to an emerging set of probiotic alternatives to conceiving and managing life. And those that relate most to agriculture and forestry, which I'll expand on in the rest of the talk, would be ideas around regenerative agriculture, about biological pest control, but also about forms of rewilding and de-domestication of organisms that are seen to have this ability to restore the desired dynamics of ecological systems in the contemporary present. So that's the grand claim. There's clearly quite a lot of difference between these domains of policy. The probiotic turn happens at different times in these different domains. There's a lot of borrowing and trafficking in scientific concepts between the micro and the macro. But the proposal is that there is something to be gained from thinking systematically across these different scales with this common historical narrative that links them together. Okay, so if we look to ground this more pragmatically in the food system itself, we could think about manifestations of the probiotic turn in relation to food production, and we can also think about manifestations of the probiotic turn in relation to food consumption. So I'm going to talk a little bit about regenerative agriculture and rewilding, and then turn to developments in food consumption, particularly around what Heather Paxson terms the rise of post-Pasteurian approaches to food production. And by post-Pasteurian, she's talking about the selective cultivation of beneficial microbes in food production while still keeping pathological microbes at bay, which is why it's, I guess, post-Pasteurian. If Pasteur was the famous French scientist who identified the microbial roots of many forms of disease and many problems with food, this is a kind of recalibration of Pasteurianism in relation to food consumption. Okay, so if we start with production, and we can look very in general terms about the rise of what's now becoming described as regenerative agriculture, popularized in this recent Netflix documentary narrated by Woody Harrelson, of all people, entitled Kiss the Ground. And regenerative agriculture in some ways develops out of agroecology, which is an older way of trying to combine agriculture and ecological thinking. But for the purposes of at least for the documentary, it's configured around these 5 principles, 5 ways in which life is both being conceived and managed differently for agricultural purposes. So minimizing disturbance, a great deal of focus on the soil and the root system as a way of both developing soil fertility, but also sequestering carbon. This way of trying to reintegrate animals into agricultural systems where arable and livestock systems might have been separated, and a wider focus on biodiversity through forms of agroforestry or ways of sort of reconciling the interests of wildlife and agriculture through farming practices. And so we focus in on dimensions of regenerative agriculture that really illustrate this idea of using life to manage life. We can look, for example, at this great focus now on the soil microbiome, this interest in, as the figure from this piece in Nature Reviews Microbiology puts it, manipulating the soil microbiome to mitigate the negative consequences of climate change. So this interest, particularly with the rise of next generation sequencing that makes visible the soil microbiome, in trying to find ways of manipulating the soil to put it to work to sequester carbon, as well as to improve soil fertility. We could think about this renewed interest in various forms of crop diversity, crop rotations, and particularly the use of legumes, a set of plants that are very good at drawing down nitrogen and fertilizing the soil. Various ways of complexifying agricultural systems, moving away from monocultures to use plants as tools for improving soil fertility, returning to traditional forms of crop rotation, but also imagining new modes of precision agriculture that could recalibrate these ecological systems to try and address some of the blowbacks that I described previously. In some models, though not in all models, there is a new role played for pest control agents, a sense that you could minimize the use of pesticides by replicating predator-prey dynamics in agricultural systems through forms of integrated pest management or biological pest control, in here using nematodes that are the natural predators of slugs, or using ladybirds that are the predators of aphids. Again, ways of using life to manage life that would minimize the use of antibiotic chemicals. And then perhaps most controversially in this space, this growing enthusiasm for repurposing cattle as tools for tackling climate change rather than the problems as the cause of climate change. So a model of grazing made famous by Alan Savory called holistic grazing, or sometimes dubbed mob grazing, again popularized in this recent documentary, Sacred Cow, in which cows are reconfigured as large herbivores that would once have been part of grazing systems, and there are technologies deployed to move them across the landscape in ways that would, the argument goes, replicate the grazing dynamics of large herds of cattle or bison in various landscapes. And the idea is that these grazing dynamics would help to sequester more carbon in the soil. And this has been the source of a great deal of debate and discussion, but we get a sense of how the cow is being retooled as a tool for tackling climate change, rather than just as a tool for providing meat and dairy. Okay, and this work on repurposing herbivores speaks to this new approach to conservation that's described as rewilding, which is less concerned with agricultural production, but more concerned with delivering ecosystem services that are understood to have been threatened by modern forms of land management. And the version of that that's perhaps best known in the UK comes from the NEP Rewilding project, which is a former dairy farm in Sussex in the UK, just taken out of production. And the owners, Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, reintroduced small herds of hardy breeds of de-domesticated animals, horses, pigs, and cattle, in order to replicate the grazing dynamics that they thought would have characterized this landscape at the end of the last ice age. And this is very much configured around delivering ecosystem services with very marginal livestock production. Another example would be the increasing enthusiasm in the UK for beavers, where beavers are being imagined as ecosystem engineers. So beavers can be restored and fenced into particular catchments with flooding problems, and beavers, through their dam building, help to slow the flow of water through a system. They help to clean the water. They create spaces for biodiversity. Bottom left, you see Michael Gove, who was a keen enthusiast for beaver reintroduction, presiding over a reintroduction in the Forest of Dean in the UK. So again, it's a repurposing of the organism here. The beaver is a keystone species that could tackle systematic problems with river systems. And perhaps the grandest and most bizarre version of this is a proposal by two Russian zoologists, Sergei and Nikita Zimov, father and son, who are responsible for managing a large tract of Siberia, so up in northeast Russia. And they're particularly concerned about the melting of the permafrost and the release of the methane that's stored in the permafrost. And they've proposed that one method for preventing the release of the methane is to restore large herbivores, large herds of herbivores who would trample the snow, and in so doing create this insulating blanket of snow that would prevent the melting of the permafrost. And so in their marketing materials, they promote the mammoth as the proper tool to fight global warming. So you get the sense of a keystone species that is able to manipulate the dynamics of carbon on a planetary scale, a very grand ambition for this version of probiotic thinking. Okay, so that's some examples on the macro scale. If we pivot now to think about food consumption, and the ways in which life is being rethought as a way to tackle ecological dysbiosis in the microbiome, we can think about the long history of interest in beneficial microbes, going right back to the end of the 19th century. Eli Malechnikov, famous Russian zoologist, Nobel Prize winner for his work on immunity, very interested in live yogurt consumption by peasants. Very interested in the ways in which that might, in the sort of pre-microbiome days, allow us to identify beneficial microbes that would be good for health. But what we see through the 20th century is the sanitation, the pasteurization of the modern food system, a real decline in interest in fermented food, the industrialization, the refining of food systems, and at the same time, this very niche idea of probiotics that becomes sort of identified with a set of supplements and capsules, if you like, made famous very lucratively through Yakult. Don't believe the claims you see in all adverts, and a range of different supplements up there. And I should say this isn't the version of probiotic consumption that I'm interested in. Much of these don't work. They are based on very spurious science. Instead, what's really emerging now, particularly as a result of the Human Microbiome Project, which allowed scientists to begin to do basic natural history of the human body, to look at the role played by a wide array of microbial species, particularly bacteria and fungi, in trying to understand the interrelationships between the host and the microbial organisms that make it up. And this emerging figure of the human as a holobiont, the human as a sort of superorganism, the human as an ecology, nicely captured in this promotional advert for Micropia, which is the first museum for microbes attached to Artis Zoo in the Netherlands. We get this much more richer ecological understanding of the role played by keystone microbes in configuring the dynamics of the human gut and the human ecology. And this is fueling a great deal of mainstream science, of clinical science, and a range of popular science books trying to translate this quite complex science of the microbiome into practical advice for people who want to take control of their diet, of their mood, want to understand the relationship between dietary health and mental health in different ways. And this is beginning to cascade out into a wider movement of people curious about food and curious about the ways in which different types of food and different food preparation and processing practices might have health benefits. So Heather Paxson, who I mentioned previously, did this great ethnographic study of raw milk cheese makers in upstate New York, people who had reinvented traditions of cheese making, importing traditions of cheese making from Europe, which didn't exist in a North American context. And she described them as actively involved in this post-Pasteurian model of working with microbes. So there's a sort of a knowing desire to distinguish between good microbes and bad microbes and put them to work for producing good cheese. This is part of a wider movement made famous by figures like Sandor Katz here, who's written copiously about DIY methods of doing fermentation that is becoming very mainstream in some parts of Western food cultures, this widespread interest in fermentation. And it connects to a wider set of ways in which the science of the microbiome is being translated into guides to everyday life, and particularly guides for parenting, if you like, this reappraisal of Western hygiene practices, a sense that we are disconnected from nature, that we're too clean, and that being too clean and too disconnected is in some ways pathological, and a range of books. These two are just a couple of examples, ghost written for very high profile figures in the microbiome world, basically proposing that dirt is good, that we need to sort of reset and recalibrate our relationships with dirt, part of which is about food and dietary practices. So this is another, very, very grand table, but it tries to trace on the left-hand side a range of changes that are associated with the antibiotic model of life. The middle column are the problems associated with these antibiotic models, and the column on the right-hand side are these probiotic alternatives in which people are working with microbes to try and restore some desired form of ecological balance. And some of these are around food, some of these are around domestic hygiene practices. There is this great focus on birth and the first 1,000 days as the point in the life course where children get their microbiomes. And many of these have quite profound implications for what we think it means to be modern and developed. I mean, if you look at that list on the left-hand side, these are many of the things that we've been encouraged to celebrate as the triumphs of development over the last 100 years or so. And now many of these are being implicated in some ways as being problematic or pathological. Okay, so just to circle out from that, I appreciate there's an awful lot of empirical detail in here, there's a lot of claims being made, but you get a sense of some of the broad connections that run through these different developments in these different policy domains. So the book suggests to begin with that these trends are characterized by a common set of scientific concepts, that they involve a common set of ways of managing life, and they are premised on some common ways of producing knowledge about the world. And I can say more about those in the questions that follow. But the book is also keen to point out that there are many different ways of going probiotic. So from a social science perspective, there are a range of different futures that are offered up by these ways of using life to manage life. There isn't a sort of single route to salvation that's offered by the probiotic term. So I just want to conclude quickly just by drawing out some of these differences, just to give you a sense of the diversity of what's going on in this area. So to begin with, we get this very different set of relationships to technology within the probiotic term. So there is one future which is very, if you like, eco-modernist. There's a sense that we could use contemporary technology to do ecology better, almost through forms of sustainable intensification, the use of AI, the use of drones, the use of precision agricultural techniques. At the same time, there is a kind of paleo version of the probiotic movement, in which we need to get back to our primordial sense. We need to get back to living as our ancestors would have done in various imaginaries of a paleo past. So very contrasting relationships with technology, relationships with science sketched out within this movement. Secondly, as a geographer, we always have to think carefully about where in the world one can go probiotic. So we hear a lot in Europe and North America about wildlife comeback, about forest regrowth, about the cessation of agriculture in marginal areas, or the shift towards regenerative practices in some places. But we need to think about whether this is being enabled by the radical redistribution of agriculture to the tropics that's happened as a consequence of globalization. Is it only possible that wildlife is coming back in Europe because of this de-wilding of large areas of the global south? And then thirdly, we could think about the way in which the probiotic term enables people from very different ideological backgrounds to agree on some common principles. So everything from Burger King, who've recently announced that they're embracing this regenerative moment, they're feeding their cattle a different diet. I think they're giving them, I can't remember what it is. There's a particular herb, lemongrass, which is apparently to stop them burping so much, a very corporate model of regenerative agriculture, at the same time as there are long-standing anarchist, community-supported versions of regenerative agriculture, all of which could gather under the same practices, but clearly have very different political economies, very different ways in which benefits would be distributed from these models. Okay, so that just gives you some flavor of the political diversity within this. So just to conclude then, what I'm suggesting is that if we think through this lens of the antibiotic, the blowback, and the probiotic, it gives us a new way of understanding the interconnected drivers of human and environmental health and disease in the Anthropocene. It brings to the fore new approaches to environmental management that are based on working with ecological systems in different ways, or putting ecological systems to work for us in different ways. And much of this is not a rejection of antibiotic modern science and technology. It's much more a recalibration, or what Joseph Kuhlertz, the Dutch philosopher, describes as the controlled decontrolling of ecological controls, which sounds like an oxymoron, but actually if you think about it, that's kind of what you're doing if you're playing around with microbes to make cheese, or if you're playing around with de-domesticated cows to restore desired ecologies in your Sussex farm. There's this controlled decontrolling of ecological controls. And the book suggests that there is potential here. There's a potential for a transformative politics that is ecologically sound and has sort of social justice at its heart, but there are many different ways of going probiotic on display in the contemporary present. Okay, Charles, I'm gonna stop there and go back to the see if I can stop sharing my screen and open up for any questions.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. We only have sort of one question, which I'm going to ask in a moment. So let me encourage people to ask more questions. Jamie, perhaps I could go first. And I'm interested, and with your background in the as a geographer, how you think the regenerative movement might evolve, and how different is it likely to be in different places? I mean, one could imagine one world where actually regenerative agriculture produces higher yields, as some people claim, and that the whole of agriculture transforms to a more regenerative model. you could imagine other worlds where there's a trade-off between yields and some of the practices. And then would you envisage there to be a patchwork, some areas rewild, some agriculture maintained in a highly probiotic way, and then others with the more traditional world? How do you see it evolving into the future?
Okay, thanks, Charles. I mean, it's clearly a very generous category, regenerative agriculture, as a sort of umbrella term that allows groups who would previously have disagreed with each other to sort of work with each other. I'm thinking here there's a very nice piece by Ken Giller that Tara shared with us, which I can send a link to, in which he sort of makes this case that regenerative agriculture is baggy, and it does speak across these land sharing, land sparing debates as to what is the kind of optimum way in which you could bring the interests of wildlife and food together, and all of these things from a sort of geographer and particularly kind of social geographer's perspective have to be sort of overlaid in histories of land tenure and the sort of global food supply systems as to who gets to decide in different places and where, if you like, people would want their food to be grown by. I mean, I think the thing that we've found to be so significant in the LEAP project is the relative role of meat in the future food system and how much land meat does take up and the supply chains for meat, the feed supply chains for meat. And if you see a demeatification, that horrible word of the food system, that gives you many more options, I guess, in terms of land use, because you're not having to sort of produce so much food. So I don't know. I think this is something we'd like to do some more work on, but there are obviously many different futures that you could imagine coming to pass at this contemporary juncture as net zero sort of starts to kick in as a concern for agriculture.
Thanks. The first question we can answer, can we get these slides? And the answer is yes, the talk will be posted on our website soon. I'd like to go to a question by Kelly Moran. Do you see synthetic biology, particularly the engineering of microbes, as a promising route to regenerate diversity functions in the biome, or as a misguided effort?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that we know very little about the actual microbes that are out there and the work that they're doing before one might begin to start to synthetically engineer them. It almost seems to be jumping the gun before we know, what are the active ingredients in the soil and what work are they doing. There's clearly a degree of kind of commercial logic around synthesizing microbes that then become much more amenable to forms of patent law and to sort of forms of intellectual property that would allow them to be put to work in that guise. I mean, the hype and the hope around synthetic biology has more been around the sort of repurposing of large herbivores almost as tools for saving us from ourselves. So whether that's engineering the microbiome of the cow, which we've heard quite a bit around stopping them burping so much, or even these visions of de-extincting the mammoth as a way of restoring desired grazing regimes to prevent permafrost melt. But that, I suspect, is where at least a lot of the hype is. How much investment's going in there, I'm not sure.
Okay, here's a very different question. It's from Elliot Cocker. Is there any consideration in reintroduction projects of the ethics of relocating individuals? So not whole animals, but individuals. Are we disregarding the experience of the individual animal itself in being relocated and displaced? Even if we see these species as native, that individual will of course not be familiar with the place where it's released.
It's a good question, and it's certainly not one that I've seen widely discussed in the literature, in as much as, at least in the conservation biology literature, the individual is often secondary to the species or to the herd or to the group or to the function that it's performing. I mean, if I think about the movement of beavers around the UK, which is happening quite a lot at the moment, I mean, I think they try and bring them in pairs, but those are pairs of two who've already been translocated quite a lot in their history. I mean, the beavers in the UK came from Bavaria, they've introduced to Scotland, and now they're kind of coming back from Scotland down into England. I think the large herbivores, they tend to move in more substantial numbers, so they might move a family group in that way. But no, I think the interests of the individual are often subsumed in the interest of the mass in this version of ecological management.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of merge two questions, one from Heidi Zamzow and the other from, just lost a person, forgive me. Both questions are asking about the response to the COVID-19 epidemic and whether that is antibiotic. And Heidi quotes Jonas Salk that we must learn to live with viruses, and whether there might be a blowback from the mass immunization and the other things that we're trying to do, including sanitizing of large numbers of surfaces.
It's a great question. I mean, I finished the book in just before the pandemic kicked off, really. I mean, it was sort of November 2019, and a book that was about loving your microbes was going to come out a year later. So I did write a prologue to the book, which tries to position probiotic thinking in the context of the pandemic. I mean, we have seen this massive application of antibiotic modes of managing microbes, in many countries around the use of sanitizers, the wearing of masks, and there is a concern that might leave a microbial deficit or might leave a kind of dysbiosis within people who aren't exchanging microbes in the same way. I mean, we've seen the kind of commensurable lack of colds this season, and a sense that our exposure to microbes is very different this season, which will have ramifications on the immune system. There is a sort of picture emerging that the differential experience of the virus amongst different groups might be indexed in some ways to different immune systems, and immune system microbial relations are a thing that people are thinking about. And so the relationships between diet, obesity, and COVID are sort of coming to the fore. I mean, it's hard the sort of probiotic response is often about a sort of de-intensification of agricultural systems to prevent these viruses emerging, kind of in some ways it's space-time decompression of the food system, which is quite hard to imagine, to prevent the vectors of movement around the place.
Thank you.
The viral picture. I can talk about this for hours, Charles, but probably better to move on to another question. Yeah.
It was Kelsey Monteith who asked a question, the name I couldn't find. I'm going to ask another COVID one. We're told that COVID-19 may have been a result of mixing of wildlife with people. And this is from Amanda Stibrany, who points, I know that's an oversimplification. But she asks, how does this square with the suggestions here that is healthier for our gut, etc., our gut biome to mix more with domestic animals? And if I may add something to that, then some of the arguments about intensification leading to a greater risk of zoonotic diseases getting into the human population, we know that the greatest risk of bird flu comes from free-range poultry rather than those kept in sheds. Could you comment on those two sort of slight paradoxes there?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the idea of a kind of post-Pasteurian model is to try and find some way of differentiating between good and bad microbial exposures. And so the kind of immunology behind this would distinguish between what they call sort of old friend microbes, organisms that we co-evolved with, and these more recent crowd infections that the immune system is perhaps less calibrated to and have the ability to sort of reside in populations. There's some epidemiological evidence really looks at the role of exposure to domestic animals in childhood as being protective of children against allergy and autoimmune diseases. The sort of background exposure to microbes that are associated with domestic animals that we might once have been exposed to. But clearly viruses have also been an active part of our evolutionary history and killed us off over time. So it's not that viruses that kill humans are a new thing. And there's a environmental history of plagues and other forms that have come before. I suppose it's as much the accelerated way in which they can move around the world as a consequence of globalization that is perhaps the risk, that spillover from a free-ranging population then moves along the same supply chains as intensively produced meat and bodies would travel, and so the same risk is there even if the hotspot is either within or without the factory. That's the kind of the risk factor, isn't it? Which is different from intensification. That's more about space-time compression within the sort of the disease scape of the Anthropocene.
So I'm afraid we have to finish at 1:45, but there's time for one last question, which got a couple of votes, and this is from Izzy. Jamie, do you personally eat any fermented food or probiotic foods or drinks? And can you give us some recipes?
I'm not great on recipe. I have a very good PhD student, Joshua Evans, who's been doing fantastic work on fermentation, particularly in the kind of Nordic context. So look up Josh's work. We have a sourdough starter at home, and my wife is very keen on baking. So we make sourdough bread, which obviously the microbes get killed in the baking of the bread, but there is, there's lots of sort of fermentation that happens there. I've experimented very badly with home brew and sort of nearly killed myself, so I've stopped on that side. So no, I mean there's Sendor Katz has lots of recipes. Josh is working at Noma, where they have a sort of whole book on fermentation that is worth having a look at.
Jamie, we have to finish. We have to finish here. Just before thanking you, let me thank the audience for tuning in. Thank you for your questions, and I'm sorry we've not been able to get to all of them. Jamie, as always, with your writing and just in conversation with you, you bring to any exchange this sort of very broad perspective, and it's always fascinating talking to you. So thank you so much for a really excellent talk this evening.
Great. Many thanks, Charles.